Well, this is the Dean Abbott podcast, and today my guest is O.W. Root, who I would say at this point famously goes by Necktie Salvage on Twitter. Thanks for coming back and doing this again.
I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
How are things going for you?
Good. Things are going great. Work's good. Writing's good. Trying to make a positive impact in the places I can. Trying to live life in a vital way and make a positive impact where I can, where I can see my work.
What is your work?
A lot of followers, people follow me. I write about style. I write about culture. I write about life. I write for Michigan Enjoyer. I write for Blaze, a line. I do a piece there every week. I post a lot on Twitter, podcasts, writing in the fitting room and Modern Lives. I write specifically about culture and style and modern life, and that's where my work is.
You say you're trying to make a positive impact.
Yeah.
What are you seeing that needs a positive impact?
Well, people who have listened to me talk on any podcast know the stuff I say, and I always, it depends, if it's the first podcast I do with someone or the second. But a lot of my work in style has to do with trying to improve or trying to change the way that guys understand clothes and style and how their clothes relate to themselves and how important clothes are. And so many guys have forgotten how important clothes are. They think they don't matter, but they really do matter. And, a lot of people complain about the state of the world and how everything looks really bad. And, a lot of people complain about how buildings look bad or just streets look bad or houses look bad or cars look bad or everything looks bad. People look bad, etc., blah, blah. But the truth is that we can all make a positive difference in the ways that we can. We can't change a building that is $100 million that is in our building. We can change our closet. We can change what we wear. We can try to make the world a little nicer. And we can also, in doing that, not only does it make it nicer for others, but it also makes it nicer for ourselves. And I think that this is a real psychological thing, and I think this is a real... People are depressed whether they don't know it or whether they know it or not about stuff like this. They don't realize how it gets them down. And so in my world, trying to make a positive difference as it applies to style means trying to help guys see something they might already suspect is true, which is that their clothes matter, then helping them to change that and change their life in a positive way or make that positive change in their life, which can lead to other things.
When I first became acquainted with you, you were talking about clothes almost exclusively, but you've branched out some, have you not?
Yeah. Well, yeah, a lot of the bulk of my discussion or what I write about is style, but I have always tried to, because I've been interested in other things as well,
Sure.
Because nothing's isolated either,
Right.
Clothes are clothes, but they're not just clothes. They're also related to culture. They're also related to life and the way we live our life and even the way we live in our clothes. If you think about, this directly relates to life and living. If a real pitfall that a lot of guys fall into with their clothes is they will get nice clothes or they'll get into dressing decently, and then they will be too afraid to live. They'll be too afraid to live life. They'll be afraid, I don't want to hurt my shirt. I don't want to hurt my jacket. I don't want to hurt my anything, whatever. And they protect their clothes too much and they become like a mannequin. And I've talked about this so many times. And so living life naturally in your clothes is, it's a metaphor, really. It's that, yes, your clothes are going to get dirty. They're going to get wrecked in a certain sense. They're going to show wear and tear, but it's a metaphor for life. You live in them anyway, and that's what it's about. And that's how style and clothing relates to, or at least in my writing, or at least my approach to life in general, in culture.
Years ago, probably 20 years ago, I was a Midwesterner living in New England. And I went to Texas for an extended period. And I went one night to the Green Dance Hall in Green, Texas. Have you ever heard of the Green Dance Hall in Green, Texas?
No.
No? It's a big place. Literally, it's just a big building with a great big dance floor where people come out and two-step. And there was a band, and it was literally just a big dance.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm standing in line to get into the Green Dance Hall, and I look around, and I'm a Midwesterner, probably in jeans and some kind of polo shirt and tennis shoes. And all of these guys who were natives were in cowboy boots, those sort of skinny, tapered Western jeans, you know what I'm talking about?
Mm-hmm.
The nice cowboy pants, some kind of Western shirt, the ones that have the flap and the mother of pearl on them, and a cowboy hat.
Mm-hmm.
So much so that had it not been Saturday night in Texas, had they been anywhere else in the world, you would look at this guy and think, oh, he's wearing a cowboy costume.
Yeah.
What's the relationship there between how a man dresses and the kind of man he is that constitutes well-dressed? You see what I'm saying?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Those cowboys, I supposedly, I would assume that in that context, they're well-dressed.
Mm-hmm.
And I also think about just sort of archetypes of men, that there are different sorts of men. And I think about the poet Robert Bly, whom I don't know if you're familiar with, but at his peak when he was in his 60s, probably, you see pictures of him, and he long, sort of shoulder length, shock white hair, but he would always wear, and you'd be pleased, an Oxford button down, but he always wore it with a cravat, like a great big scarf he would tie around his neck, and he would wear these like outrageously colored paisley vests all the time. It was like his trademark.
Yeah.
He's a different sort of man than the cowboy. Right? He's sort of this poetic, visionary, wild archetype.
Yeah.
So what's the relationship between the kind of man a man is and how he should dress?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that the cowboy example, or in Texas, that example is a really good one because it shows regional dress. It shows that something that is so appropriate in one region might not be appropriate in another region. And it is so right in Texas, and it would be so costumey in New England. And that shows something about culture, shows something about geography. Those cowboy boots, there's a geographical reason for them in all of this. It shows something about it shows something about culture, geography, and clothing and aesthetics, how that's all related. The example of the poet that you're talking about, who wore classical clothing to an extent, but with a certain sort of very creative twist, or the very exuberant nod.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good example of personal style. We all have a personal style. Even the most bland dresser, if he's dressing with intention, even the person who's dressing very, very, very subdued and bland, if he's dressing with intention, that's a personal style. So we all have a personal style, and that is a personal style. It's a style choice which reflects his job, his work, his occupation. He's not an accountant. He's not doing the books he's not one of 500 accountants working for McDonald's. He is this poet. He's this creative person, and he's reflecting some of that in his clothing. And that's actually a wonderful place to be with clothing, where once you get the basics down, once you understand kind of how to look decent, tweaking things and making your own personal space is a beautiful, fun thing about clothing. Often when guys are getting started dressing well, they're so overwhelmed by you can't do this, you got to do this, can't do this, you got to do this, all these rules. It almost feels so restrictive. But once you get past that, it's actually really emboldening, and you get to have a certain kind of expression, personal expression there.
It brings to mind the Robert Bly example. It also brings to mind. I don't know if you're familiar with either the band Bob Wills and his Texas Playboys, who were a Western swing band who when they perform, they wear cowboy clothes.
Yep.
Not just cowboy clothes, but kind of like outlandish, old-timey cowboy clothes.
Okay.
And the thing with Robert Bly is that if you went to hear Robert Bly read or speak about the things that he spoke about, you'd be disappointed if he was in a suit.
Yeah.
And so there is a performative element sometimes to these things.
Mm-hmm.
How does a guy dress in a way that has that performative element while not being inauthentic?
Yeah,
How does he not turn life into a play or a show every place he goes?
that's very, very good question. So these two examples are, to be fair, performative examples too that you're giving. They are performing it, and
right.
Well, actually, one is definitely the band is performing, and
so is Robert Bly,
and so is Robert Bly. He's reading his work,
right.
And so once you get into the creative sphere, the artist sphere, the performance sphere, whether it's classical music, whether it's rock, whether it's jazz, whether it's anything, whether it's a reading, whether it's poetry, whatever it is, you're getting into a different realm of society that is absolutely more performative in nature. It's a whole different ball game. But let's talk a little bit about that. We'll tone down the performative element because when many people aren't in a performative sort of field, yet everyone is, I'm going to stretch the word performing a little bit, performing to an extent when you go out anywhere because people are seeing you. You are representing yourself. People are making judgments. Everyone, whenever you see someone, you make some sort of judgment. Doesn't not good or bad, good or evil, whatever. I'm not saying that, but you're just like, okay, that person's probably into A, B, C. I could imagine they do this job, you make these judgments. And so everyone is performing to some degree because other people are seeing you. Now, how do you be aware of that without performing, without becoming inauthentic, with it still feeling organic, still feeling representative of yourself? A brass tacks practical way is just doing it. When someone starts dressing decently, and when I say decently, I mean I'm using a very, very simple bar where you start wearing a shirt with a collar. So you start wearing a shirt with a collar and you iron your shirt. For guys in 2024, that's kind of the step, that pushes you in there. The first time you wear it, you're going to feel like you're dressed up. Same thing for the 10th time, same for the 20th time. Maybe by the 50th time, you're going to stop feeling dressed up. And then by the 500th time, it's going to feel so standard that wearing anything other than it will feel like you're wearing pajamas in public. And so much of getting over a certain sense of inauthenticity, if one ever feels that, is simply doing it. And now we can talk a lot about, I talk about this a lot, about wearing clothes that are natural for your lifestyle. Not every guy should wear a suit because not every guy has a job that requires a suit or would even be appropriate for a suit. So guys require different things, and there are different ways to dress decently in a way that feels personally fulfilling. Spiritually, I don't mean in a religious sense, but like for your spiritually sort of uplifting.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not all the same at whatever level you're at. So even if you're working at home, wearing a pair of chinos, ironed khaki chinos, and an ironed collared shirt, that is so much more ennobling than sweatpants and a t-shirt.
What does it mean that when I look at Robert Bly and his cravat and his outrageous vest, I think I should do that?
Well, you are a poet, aren't you?
Uh-huh. Yes, among other things.
Yes.
But I think that's my style icon right there.
Yeah. Well, this is the thing this is the thing we all everybody likes a different sort of thing, and
Mm.
even if it's in that same, different guys drift toward different, here's a good example. Some guys who are really into dressing well. Here's two, and now these are two really old examples, and so it's really good because it's just really old. And I know a lot of really young guys don't even know who these people are, but they'll do the job. Cary Grant or Fred Astaire,
Mm.
both classic style icons, very different style, very
Oh,
different.
really?
Yet they're wearing almost the same stuff, very different. Fred Astaire is much flashier, much more of a much more exuberant, much more
Mm.
eccentric in his style. Cary Grant, much more subdued, much more uh, subdued.
Mm.
And they're both great. They're both fantastic, but different guys drift towards different. Cary Grant or Fred Astaire. What do you like? Which guy? And I love them both in a certain way. Of course, it's not
Sure.
about right or wrong, but you can see in guys' style where they're going to go.
But doesn't having a style in some way require a level of self knowledge?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I mean, well, it's like, yeah, it's similar to, I mean, can you prepare food if you don't know the recipe? I mean, you can, but it's hard to call it a dish.
Mm.
If you're just, I mean, you can't just throw stuff in a pot and yeah, you could eat it. But to really say, well, I'm a cook,
Mm.
you have to know something, or I'm a chef, or I can cook, that implies, okay, if I add this, I know it's probably going to do this.
Mm.
If I do this, it's probably going to taste like this. And the same thing for style.
So all these questions have been kind of laying the groundwork for my real question, which is this. So we have a crisis of style in a sense. I mean, I think
Yeah.
that's what you
Yeah.
say, right?
Yeah.
There's a crisis of style. Isn't that in some way related then to like this sort of crisis, some kind of crisis of self knowledge, to a crisis of being in a way?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, all this stuff is related. I mean, it sounds sort of almost dismissive to say all this stuff is related, but it's not dismissive. It's not. It sounds almost like just overly broad to say it's all related, but it's not.
Right.
All of this stuff. I mean, so there's so many levels here. So first one is this. What we see today is, in a certain sense, when people have no. I'm talking about guys specifically because I talk about guys mostly.
Mm.
When they have no coherent style of their own. They don't have any, and I'm not saying they're trying. I'm saying they're not even trying. Anybody who's trying is doing something right, in a sense. So they're not even trying. They have no desire to have a coherent style of their own. They have no desire to cultivate that domain of their life. And you don't have to read about it 2 hours a day. You don't have to come up with esoteric theories. You don't. The baseline is not being me. The
Mm.
baseline is ironing a shirt in the morning. So when they don't do that, it's a certain sort of saying, I don't even care about this domain. And I'm not even going to do anything for it. And it's so passive. There's a passivity there where this is such a present domain in your life because you wear clothes 24/7 all the time, wear clothes all the time. That what does it say if you're passive about something that's so present? That also reflects a certain sort of passivity or passiveness in other domains as well. Or it definitely shows a certain kind of giving up or a retreating or a helplessness in other domains. And I think it's obviously connected. I think we see that. I think we see that together.
So I wanted to have you come back because I wanted to talk. You've been tweeting a lot lately about what I was calling zeal for life.
Yeah, yeah.
And I'm not sure what terminology you use when you think about that concept, but what has happened to us I don't know if it was ever the case that every individual person in America, for example, had some sense of self. but it seems like part of what you're implying is that most people don't, and that comes out in this sort of attitude toward life, which is uninvested.
Yes.
Am I getting that right?
Yeah, I think that's really good. Uninvested. I think a lot of it comes to do with media in a way. And I know everybody says media, blame the media for blah blah blah. I'm not saying even the content of the media. I'm saying the ability to consume media. You could consume the best media on earth. You could develop the best, I mean, most moral, most high spirited, most high minded, most everything. You could just inculcate yourself with that only.
Like you could listen to the Dean Abbott podcast.
Like the Dean Abbott podcast.
Right,
You
exactly.
could stream the Dean Abbott podcast 24/7.
Right.
No, I'm serious.
And still.
I mean, you could have a landscape where everything is just amazing. It's everything you want in terms of good, actually higher minded stuff.
Mhm.
But if you're just consuming it, you're constantly consuming, you become a spectator in the world in a way.
Mhm.
You're becoming like a spectator, a passive spectator in life. You're watching life happen. You're scrolling on life. And this is related to the digital age as well. We have the possibility to become so digitalized ourselves that the real world, I mean, we shift all of our focus inward, inward, inward into the digital realm, and the whole world outside sort of falls away. And we don't really act in it. And then we just become passive consumers of the media, the digital media, in this small world, this digital world that we're existing kind of like zombies in the active world, but not really being a participant. And I think so much of this is just we have the ability to do that, so we do that. People have the ability to just consume and consume and consume and consume and become passive observers that they just do. And
Well,
yeah.
here's the limit of saying it's the media. And so the limit of that, I think, is to say, okay, people have the option to become passive consumers of life.
Yeah.
But that doesn't answer the question, why do they prefer that?
Yes, this is a good question. Honest, so if you want to get really deep with it, I guess
This is the Dean Abbott podcast.
People just want to die. It's just a death wish. They just want
I
to
think
die.
that may be correct. Say more about that.
Yeah, they just want to die. They just long for the coffin. They long for the grave. They long to just be dead.
Because it's the only time they'll dress well.
Exactly.
It's the only time they'll wear a suit.
Because feels great. The best I ever looked. No, I mean, I think people want to. There is almost this like death wish, this passive death wish, this wish to not have to do anything and just be gone and be dead. I mean, that sounds crazy, it sounds creepy, but there is this inkling there. And this is the thing, is that in the past, it's not that everybody, often when we extol the past, it's not because everyone was inherently the most virtuous person on planet Earth. Not at all. But often you basically just couldn't do certain things, and you had to do something to procure food, most likely. Something, I mean, just most basic things. And it forced you to do stuff. It forced you into action. It doesn't mean you were reading philosophy all day, but it forced you into something. Some active, this is a very base level thing. I do an action and I get something in return. I do an action and I eat, or I see some success in a certain extent, which makes my life better to some degree, even if it just means me no longer being thirsty. And we've ascended to a place, ascended or descended, however you want to put it, where we can almost be the walking dead. We can almost be zombies. We can almost be dead while still living.
Where did that desire to be dead come from?
Good question, right? I mean, we really get into.
Let me say it this way, because when you watch a Cary Grant movie, that desire, or even if you just look back at the artifacts of, say, American culture from the 30s or 40s, or you meet people who are still around from that time, or you've ever met people from that time, it's clear that that ethos was not as, at least not as present in American culture.
For sure.
Something has brought us here to where that sort of deathward living is commonplace.
Absolutely.
Almost that people forgot that they're living deathward.
Yeah, absolutely. So where does this come from? I mean, is it a concoction of? So I mean, the big one you could say it's kind of a problem of meaning. You could say people feel useless because when you're dead, you're useless. You know, when you're dead, you're useless. You can't do anything. You're dead. So people feel useless in a sense. And why do they feel useless? There's always, I think, with a lot of questions like this, there's a lot of right answers. You know, often whenever I talk to people, they almost think there's only one right answer. I'm like, there's like 10, maybe 100. They're all explaining a different aspect of it. I mean, you could talk about job. This is a super boring one, but you could talk about jobs and work. You could talk about whether we liked it or not. Jobs stunk in the old days often, but someone needed to do the job, so you were needed. There wasn't as much money, so people needed other people to take care of them at one point in time. Or needed to take care of each other to some degree. Having children itself, you are needed because you have to take care of that child, especially when they're extremely young. You have to do it. There is no other option. You are deeply needed. You could talk about a spiritual sort of problem, you know, where people feel as though there is no greater meaning in life. You know, you can talk about a very materialistic, atheistic, certain sort of thing where what is the point? Where we've arrived at this thing where I'm not needed by my family because everyone has so much money. I'm not needed by my community because I have no community. There is no meaning, a bigger, greater meaning beyond it because they don't feel a certain religious draw towards that. And they're not even acquainted with any other sort of philosophical sort of thing, you know, any sort of, even if they were into mythology, you know, they're not even into that, you know, I mean, they're not even with any sort of classic anything. And so they just sort of have arrived at this point where all of my needs are kind of met. I will not starve to death. It is not going to happen. You know, I mean, you're in America, 2024. I will not starve to death, basically.
Sure.
So what do? I just zone out and don't really care, you know, and they can't get going. And it's a spiral. I think a lot of times with people, things spiral like that. And it's tragic, really.
It seems to me that there are what we would call intellectual currents and practical currents. So that, yes, we have been unmoored from our sort of spiritual sense of meaning. It's so fascinating. I have been teaching teenagers Plato some last few months. And it's in even just reading a few Platonic dialogues, you see very clearly how Socrates is laying the foundation for what it means to be meaningful, or at least a Western conception of meaning.
Yeah.
And so that by the time first Augustine and then much, much later Aquinas rolls around, they fuse this with a kind of Christian understanding of things that gets disseminated to people.
Yeah.
That creates even for people who think of themselves as not particularly religious, creates a scaffolding of meaning for their lives.
Exactly. You're within this scaffolding, whether you realize it or not. You know, that's one of those things. Exactly.
And so we get pride away from that. So, for example, how many high school students in America read Plato? Almost zero.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because he's not difficult to read. I mean, literally all of those dialogues are just plays.
Yeah.
and he has lots of interesting things to say.
Yeah.
But we've been pried away from all of those sources.
Yeah.
And at the same time, one of the things I've thought for years is that if you go to Walmart, it's interesting how in America, sometime in my lifetime, so maybe in the 90s, Americans, it seems to me, really made a deal, which was give us everything for our homes cheap, cheap, cheap. And you can take all of the public spaces and destroy them.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so a there is in our culture a kind of current that carries you by default into private domicility, shall we say that?
Yeah.
So that you become not even if you not even it's not even homedness. It's not even being at home in your place. It's that you have a private domicile and everything, and that is the place that you escape from the hell of your public life.
Yes. Yes. This is majorly true. I did a tweet years ago, I think, one time that said it was a poll. It wasn't even a poll, it was a tweet. It was that you have two choices. You can have the most beautiful house and you live in absolute disgusting hell outside, or you can make public space actually beautiful, but you have a lot less. You are not that wealthy inside your house. What do you choose? You can't have both. And it's an interesting thing to put out there because what you're saying is it is the opposite. I think about the piazza or the plaza in Spain or Italy, where historically you have the center of the town and you had essentially the church and you have a fountain. You have some fountains and they're still quite beautiful. You have a lot of restaurants and cafes all around, and it's very pleasant to be there. It's very pleasant and it's very nice. And it doesn't really exist in our American space today. That doesn't really exist. And I think a lot of people talk about this and they will blame a lot of factors. And there are a lot of factors. But one of them is kind of what you said is that people truly don't care enough because they most likely are not willing to. They aren't willing to make the sacrifice in a certain sense, for some of this stuff, I think.
It's interesting. One of the visual markers of all this is if you go to some place that has a historic theater, it was built in the 20s or in the early days of cinema.
Yeah.
These things are just positively rococo in their design.
Yeah.
And people used to pay a nickel to go in there and watch Cary Grant or whatever. So compare that experience to streaming at home.
Oh yeah, this is yeah. You're really getting to this contributes to the antisocial nature that has really risen, like you said when you said about this private domicility, and basically we made this deal with the devil where we're going to get a bunch of stuff for we can get. I saw you can get like a 90-inch TV at this point. 90 inches for God's sake. It's like
Right.
You can get the most crazy stuff. And in many ways, the current trajectory that was set, I think people would more or less be okay with living in a compound that is really nice inside. If everything else in just
really nice defined as having all these things.
Yes. When I say really nice, I don't mean actually nice. I just mean you got a bunch of cheap plastic LED stuff from China, know?
Right.
And so people be okay with that and a war zone outside, basically. And I think that this is the physical one of the deeper problems that is so big people forget it even exists, and it is representative of this larger trend toward this inwardness and it's not an inwardness like, oh, I'm really reflecting and getting to a spiritual plane that I've never understood before. No, it's an inwardness of kind of giving up and feeling less engaged in the world. And I think that to a certain extent, something that's really interesting is that the more perfect things get, in a certain sense, in a certain way, or the closer to less chaos we get, the worse it gets, the more uh, shut in like we get. You know, because that time you're talking about, these beautiful public theaters or these beautiful theaters they made, the world was so chaotic then. It's next level. We live in a dollhouse compared to the chaos of the early 20th century, you know?
Mhm.
I mean, really, you know? I mean, and so this is why I kind of focus a lot about embracing the drama, embracing the chaos of life, because that is kind of where life is itself.
Well, what do you mean by chaos? I mean, why would we want to embrace a war zone?
We don't want to embrace a war zone, but there's this interesting thing where why is it that this is very fascinating stuff. There's some interesting correlation between it's like you flip. If you're really close to perfection, think about it like a table. When you bring a table back, you get a brand new table, you bring it into your house. You haven't had a single scratch on it. That is the most terrifying position you're at ever with this table, because you know that first scratch is coming, and when it comes, you're like, "Oh God, the table!" You know, you're gonna be so sad about the table.
Uh-huh.
Once the first scratch happens, it's like, okay. Then the second, third, fourth, and then you forget about it less. And years later, it's got a tons of scratches, but it's now your table, and you actually have all these memories built up with it. But when you can keep it perfect, when it's close to perfection, it's the most anxiety inducing, because you are so afraid of what could happen. And think about this with our lives too. You know, we have this ability today where, again, we're not going to starve to death. We have really incredible medical stuff too, where, you know, we think we really don't feel like we might die any day in a certain sense. And of course we don't want to. Thank God for modern medicine. I'm so glad, so happy. But it leads to all of this. And with I've got to I've got to have everything just right. And it's possible for me to have everything just right. And I've got to have life be exactly as I thought it would be. And if it's not, it's a failure and it's terrible and I cannot fail. It's better to, hedge everything, be extremely hedge just all your bets, be very careful, take no risks, totally risk averse, just so I stay perfect and I don't make any mistakes. There is a sense among a certain block of society today, that is a real sense. And that is not a sense that really was allowed to exist in the past, because the chaos of life was thrust upon them. Even the chaos of dying, not knowing mortality, stuff like this. And yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No, go.
In my hometown, I grew up in the only slightly bad neighborhood, very working class.
Yeah.
About 6 blocks away, there was what we always thought of as the real bad neighborhood.
Yeah.
Now, in the 1920s, when the real bad neighborhood was built, and the unions and organized labor was a new thing.
Yeah.
There was a factory owned by a corporation out in the real bad neighborhood. And the workers all lived around the factory in this neighborhood.
Yeah.
And one day they went on strike, and they were out striking for better conditions.
Yeah.
When management opened the windows of this factory, and a few guys took a few shots with rifles at the strikers.
Yeah.
So because these are working class guys in Indiana who have not changed that much, they all just thought, well, we should go home. So they did go home, and they got their own rifles and came back and shot up the factory. Now, fortunately, no one was killed. Okay.
Yeah.
This is an example of the way, when you say life was more chaotic, it was in fact actually much less regulated. And those if that happened now, it would be SWAT, Navy SEALs would be parachuting out of to get that under control.
Yeah, that's interesting.
and CNN would be there with some kind of mobile truck.
Yes,
So
totally.
everything becomes both a violation and a spectacle.
Yes, totally. Totally.
And when you live in a world where no one's going to shoot at you, and you don't even have to stand up for anything. So we live in this like hyper regulated world.
Yes. Yes.
On one hand, and on the other hand, I think people respond to that by saying, "Who are you to tell me that I can't wear pajamas to Walmart?" Because that is what's not regulated.
Exactly.
All social norms are gone because in fact they're replaced by all of these kinds of almost like legal regulations.
Yeah, it's like a kind of it's like it's somewhat related to like an anarcho tyranny sort of concept where
I'll tell everybody what that means.
It's you have this extreme regulation, which essentially, I mean, however you want to look at it, often what ends up getting punished or what ends up getting most highly regulated are the things that are, it essentially allows the unreasonable and the tyrannical aspects of the unreasonable sort of mob in a certain sense to overrun any certain sort of normal life of any sort of normal life for anyone else. And essentially it's forgetting the big picture, focusing on the little picture, and creating this society which is weirdly tyrannical but weirdly anarchic at the exact same time. And it's, again, there's other people who are better at explaining this, but it's one of those things that definitely characterizes our time today, where it's also part of the reason why it's hard to understand the past sometimes, because it was both more, people were both more
inclined to shoot back.
Yeah, inclined to shoot back. Yet weirdly, it's that people were more impulsive and less impulsive. It isn't basically the trajectory of history in the past 100 years is not linear, and that's what's very, very strange for people to try to wrap their head around. And when I talk about embracing that drama, I'm not saying you've got to go shoot up the factory like these guys in the old days when they shoot at you, because you're not going to get shot at because that's not happening.
Right.
That's not how it works. So you're not in this scenario where you're shooting at the factory and they're saying this. I'm not saying anything like this. I'm saying, though, that there is this impulse to how to put it? I have this path. There is this path that you can take, that if you do everything right, your life can actually be very secure, and you can have an historically inordinate amount of money. And it also will be very boring in the worst way possible. And I refer to this also as early senior citizenism. This interesting thing where like people are becoming old folks when they're like 35 years old. And that sounds weird, but you kind of see
What do you mean?
So a lot of this is related to childlessness and dinkism. So I have this theory that, so basically throughout history, your life was kind of like this. You kind of were, when you're a kid, you didn't know what the heck was going on. And this changes based on the century we're talking about. You didn't know anything was going on. Then you learn a little bit more. Then you get married, and you finally are like, okay, I'm married. That's kind of good. Then you have kids, and you're like, oh my gosh, I don't know what I'm doing. Then you have a whole bunch of chaos for, I don't know, 20 years, probably, because you're having kids at that point. Then, however long it is, then you finally, those kids are gone, everything like this, and then they're having their own kids and stuff like this. Then maybe you stop working, and then a few years you die. A few years later, die. So you got a few years of kind of not really having much chaos going on, much, whoa, I'm learning a lot, I'm on the ropes, kind of, everything's on me, you have only a few years where you can just sort of sit back and relax, and then you die. And that's kind of historically how it was, really, just the old folk.
Yeah.
But now it's possible, very possible, for you to basically achieve old folks home when you're like 29 years old, like 28 years old. You can basically not ever have, you can transition out, you can get a college, you can get out of college, get some sort of job that is, again, extremely mundane, extremely boring, also not particularly difficult, make more than enough money to live very, very comfortably, and never have kids, never really go on any adventure, never really seek out anything else, but just sort of basically live your life Netflixing
Mhm.
for the next 50 years. And you're kind of just an old folk at that point when you're in your 20s. And it's very interesting.
And the spiritual cost of that is zombification,
Exactly.
whatever.
Exactly. Because this is the thing. These people, this sort of movement isn't, oh, I just want to have stability so I can really seek greater spiritual, religious transcendence. They're not putting all this extra time in developing anything or developing any meaningful intellectual or spiritual growth or philosophical growth. None of that. No, it's just consumerism, very boring senior citizen consumerism. And I mean, that's what it is. And it's this you have this desire to become old folks when you're like 25, when you're
Mm.
30. And kids, when you have kids, they just inject all this chaos. They inject all this stuff. We're like, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm trying to figure this out. Every day, you're trying to figure stuff out. Every day, you're on the ropes. And your life is messier. Your life is more chaotic. Everything is crazier. But that is how it's supposed to be. It's that it's unnatural for it to be so stable for that long.
Mm.
And that's the thing. And this is where the friction is, where we seek out stability. We want to conquer the natural world and establish stable civilization. Yet it's also it's this comes back to almost the death wish.
Mhm.
We don't actually want to conquer. It's that the saddest thing to ever happen would be to conquer mortality. The most
Mhm.
depressing thing on earth would be to conquer mortality. And
Mhm.
so we don't want to actually. And so, yeah.
So again, we go back to the question: if it's possible to have what you're calling old folksism at 27,
Yeah.
doesn't the inclination that people have to opt for that speak to a level of insecurity, a level of fear, perhaps even of trauma at some level that makes that sort of life appealing?
Yeah.
Because I can't help but think that part of that, the move in that direction, has to come from a deep sense that if I don't do this, so it's a weird thing. It's almost like how you end up. I think people end up in this dilemma. Do I choose this sort of the the deathward movement of this staid, meaningless, ultra stable life, or do I choose the something else which will also kill me? Do you see? There's got to be some like underlying
Yes.
emptiness or fear that level of zombification of kind of mindless rote pursuit of the cultural script
Yeah.
that speaks to that level of anxiety or fear somehow.
I think that there is absolutely a lack in confidence. I think there is. I think part of this has to do with, I mean, you could say that there's different ways you can take this. In some ways, people feel almost dwarfed by the computer.
Mm-hmm.
They feel scared because they almost feel like they're not the most powerful anymore. The computer is so powerful, the computer knows all this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And then linked up to that is almost you hear people almost be afraid of, oh, if these mistakes, like with the era of the internet, I'll never be able to escape if I need to have my good job at this and this and this and this, and if I do these other things, I won't be able to get a job because then I did these other, and it's not responsible, blah blah blah, all sort of stuff. And there's almost the totalitarian, almost monitoring state of the
Mm.
internet makes it so you want to just be like a bug. You just want to be in prison. You're living in the panopticon. And so if everything I do is remembered forever, it's best for me to just sort of walk along and just do the things in the middle that doesn't offend anybody. But then in my mind, kind of imagine something else, or maybe do something else, watch adventure on
Mhm.
Netflix, or escape in that way, even though I'm too afraid to do it myself. That's what that sort of escapism is in my real life. So I just sort of get along or just go along with that. And so there is this, I think that plays a real role here. This fear, this lacking of confidence, and this, yeah, lacking confidence. So,
So, what's the solution for people?
you
Dress
know,
better.
well, the thing about dressing better too, I've said this too many times and too many whatever, but when I realized that when I realized that back in the old days when they dressed better, when things were worse, it was a feature, not a bug, meaning that there's a reason why they were dressing better when things were bad. That sort of clicked a lot of things for me. When you are dressed better, you kind of, okay, so things kind of went wrong that day, whatever. At least you have clothes that don't make you feel worse. Your clothes in a certain sense, they'll always make you feel worse and they'll lessen the highs and they'll lower the lows. Bad clothes, and you don't dress in a way that makes you feel good about yourself. If you dress with a way that makes you feel good about yourself, it'll make the highs feel a little better and even the lows just not quite as low. So it levels that stuff up just a little bit. And
Right.
so, in a certain sense, when you have that kind of stability, a certain reaffirmation of strength and confidence in your dress, that gives you some greater momentum and
Mm.
confidence and willingness to take those risks. And in a certain sense, it kind of gives you something where, okay, well, everything goes wrong, I still have this. And that sounds weird, but I believe there's a lot of truth to it because there's a strong correlation between people dressing better and taking greater risks in the past and having a more confident, outward looking, vital approach versus today. And I think when I talk about this, it's really not talking about it in a I'm trying I don't try to talk about it in a preachy tone. I try to talk in about a tone where every life is messy. Life is
Mhm.
screwed up. There is no way you were going to get out without any scars or without any bruises or without anything happening. That's not happening. You're not getting out alive.
Right.
You are not getting out alive. So the sooner you accept that, the better you're off you're going to be
Hmm.
because then you can start living fully. And yeah, things
Hmm.
are going to get messed up. Big deal. Read all this stuff on social media. People are like, you got to have this by this age. You got to do this. Otherwise, you're screwed. Who cares? Shut up. You
Did you
know,
see the tweet going around yesterday? If you're a young man in your 20s, buy a Rolex.
I
It.
saw this. I
You
did.
literally tweet about Timexes from time to time, I think.
Yeah, I do. Timex. Yeah, this watch. This watch right here. I
Yeah.
love this watch. It's an old 80s. Let me see if I can get this thing in focus.
Yeah.
Seiko.
Uh-huh.
Or is it Casio? Let's Seiko. Got this bad boy for $25 at a watch store. Used. It's beautiful. I wish I could
Uh-huh.
focus better. Yeah, yeah, look at that.
Yeah.
It's 19. It's beautiful. $25. Enough of this Rolex thing. I think I did a parody tweet where I was like, if you're in your 20s, you need to follow Necktie Salvage, retweet them, post them, share the screenshots, go into debt if you have to.
All right.
No, this is one of the great. I see this across a lot. I see people. I'll tell you, I've known people. I'll put it this way. I've known people who have hedged all of their bets constantly, hedge
Mm.
everything. They're never going full. They're always hedge, always taking the safe bet. They are. It really doesn't work out that much. You really don't get that much.
Right.
You really don't. Like, I mean, I'm not trying to. I'm not trying to be I'm not saying that everything's going to work out great if you don't. I'm going to say it, life's a mess. Life stuff happens. You do the best you can. That's what it's about. We all end up the same place anyway. Your life is a story. Do you want to have it be some boring thing that would be on a greeting card that you bought for 99 cents? Or would you rather have it be something interesting that wow, I learned something. I went up and down. I went here and there. I learned things about success and tragedy and all this. That's going to happen. Can't run from life.
Hmm.
And that's what I am about. And today you have an opportunity. we have an opportunity today where the medicine is amazing. You can make money in all these different ways. I mean, you do not have to be even in the right physical place. You can make all this money on your own. You can find ways to do it. Do this and live a life that you enjoy. Live a life that is something that is vital, not something that don't take the easy way because don't take the boring way because there's no reason to do so.
Mhm. Mhm.
You have nothing to lose, really. And people say, I do. You have far less to lose than you think. You really do. I mean, if you're 25 years old, I mean, come on.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. Two things that come to mind. The first is that we've been talking about this sort of desire to be dead.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting, or the thing that comes to mind that I find interesting is that after Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead, he calls into the tomb and tells Lazarus to come out, and Lazarus comes out. The first thing Jesus says after that is, get him out of his death clothes, right? Because there is this, he's in a shroud, essentially, and shrouds are appropriate for people who are dead. And that in some way, at a really deep level, this is what you're trying to get at. You're trying to say, dress like you're alive.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I love that. I love that. That's so true. That's so true. It is that's like the deepest level of this. Absolutely. You're so right. Yeah, dress like you are alive. Dress like you have something to do. Dress like you are engaging with the world. And all of these things, everybody knows who has done this stuff. It's little steps. It's little steps. We all know, if you just have something going in the right direction, that can lead to other things. I I really you try to talk about these things and it's not to beat down on people. It really is not. It's not a
Sure.
preachy sort of thing. It's saying
You're,
just do it.
you're saying, come out.
Yeah, yeah, it's saying this is why reading history is good, I think. Reading about our past, 2 generations back, 3 generations back, 4 generations back, life was so tumultuous. So many things happened. People went up and down, they moved, they had to go, they had successes, they had failures, all this sort of stuff. Stuff happens. And that's life, that's life. So it's going to be hard, but embrace it. Embrace life. And it sounds so boring. I know it sounds almost cliche, but I really believe that once we feel that, and people struggle with this, once we do that, you can enjoy life more.
We'll kind of close with this, your thoughts on this, but it seems to me now that we've talked, yes, there is a kind of will toward death in our culture.
Yeah.
But there's also something that we might call sort of a metaphor for asleep, right? That most people are asleep. That most people don't consciously think, I'm going to live this sort of scripted life because I want to. It's just they're asleep. That's what they've been told. Yeah. And it strikes me that our audiences, the people we're trying to speak to, are the people who are half awake.
Yeah.
And that's only in this moment has it occurred to me. That's why I'm doing what I'm doing, right? That's who this show is for. This podcast is for. Yeah. And that's who you're trying to talk to, I think, too.
Exactly. And those people who are asleep, I think what also is important to remember is that the general thrust of the society is one towards sleepiness, towards the sleepiness. People will go the general thrust. Kind of, when guys dressed better back in the old days, it's not because every guy was a clothes hound, but it's that society pushed them in that direction.
There was a spirit to the culture.
Exactly. It pushed them towards that direction. And so people are pushed towards that direction. And the people, like you said, they're half asleep, half awake. We're trying to get them to this side. That is what we're trying to do. We're trying to not float down the river like a dead body. We're trying.
Yes. And one more, I said that was last, but one more thought is it seems to me too, that part of what we've been saying is that when you kind of live this scripted, sterilized life, the whole point of that is to minimize your suffering.
Yeah.
But the problem is that the thing that wakes you up is suffering.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that, so maybe what you're saying in your work is dress like you've suffered.
I love that. I love that because, yeah, I love that phrase. I love that way of putting it because that, because this idea of suffering too, I mean, really ideally, we're supposed to be thankful for the good and the bad. We're supposed to be thankful for the joy and the suffering. Ideally, really, it's hard for us to do. It's really hard for us to do, especially at the time. But that is a part of the human experience of life. And not only the human experience, but just of spiritual growth, growth as an individual. God, the world, however you want to understand it, is teaching us things even when we don't want to learn it. And many times those things involve ups and downs, this way and this way. And sometimes you don't even know what is being taught to you, but you are. And avoiding that drama, that chaos, like with children. Children teach you so much. Some things that
Because they cause suffering.
and there's so much. But there's a reason why you become almost more human when you have children, because you unlock an aspect of that experience and that isn't always only full of joy, that is impossible otherwise. And we can't avoid that because that's almost avoiding what should be learning as a part of living.
Yes, it's interesting. I remember almost my first thought when both of my girls were born was, this child is going to leave someday. Right? And so by just coming into your life, a child represents loss.
Yeah.
Just by being.
Absolutely.
Because you don't ever want that child to go away.
Absolutely.
But he has to.
Absolutely.
Yes.
These are the things you learn.
Yes.
These are the things you learn.
Yes. These are the things you learn. I like that. Let's leave it there. Tell people where you want them to find you.
You can find me on X, formerly known as Twitter, Necktie Salvage. Yeah, go to X, Necktie Salvage, and I've got a link tree in my bio, and you can find so much there. I write on Substack, The Fitting Room. It's all about style, daily memos. I also write on Substack Modern Lives, which is just writing about life. It's more creative writing. And then I also have Patreon where I do a podcast. I've got all my links to everything I do on my link tree on x.com/Necktie Salvage.
All right. Thanks for doing this. Let's do it again sometime.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Dean.
Sure.